Empires in the age of imperialism. So this is going to focus on about three different empires. So you're going to be looking at the Ottoman Empire. We're going to be looking at the Qing Empire, and then we're going to get into Russia a little bit too with this chapter. So really, this is, you guys should know enough about imperialism that it's essentially, stronger countries taking over lesser countries, usually for resources and things like that. And so we're going to kind of see some early trends with imperialism. And then this is going to help jettison us to some of the world wars and things like that. All right, so we're going to start with the Ottoman Empire. And so there's a lot that's going to be going on in this section. So if you have to, start, pause, that kind of thing to get all the information down, make sure you do that. So we're going to start in Egypt. And we're going to be looking at kind of the Napoleonic example, like what they do in Egypt, that kind of thing. And so in 1798, Napoleon invades Egypt, and he defeats the Mamluk forces, Mamluk, that he encountered there. And about 15 months later, after a series of military defeats, Napoleon actually returns to France and seizes power and makes himself emperor. His generals had really little hope of holding on to power in Egypt. And so in 1801, the rest of the French forces end up withdrawing as well. And so a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali, he's on there, he emerges as the victor. And then you kind of have this power struggle take place after that. Muhammad used many of what the French practices in efforts to build up the Egyptian state. This looked at things like modern schools for training military officers. He started building factories, which we'll find out the British didn't like. And he was trying to really help build up his army so that he didn't have another Napoleon-type invasion in his country. And so he's doing a lot of reforms there. In the 1830s, his son Ibrahim invades Syria, and he starts similar reforms there, trying to really modernize the country. And all of this is because they are looking at what is going on with Great Britain, with France, with Belgium, with some of these, with Europe really just becoming an industrial power. And then looking across the ocean, seeing that, look, America's kind of doing the same thing, so we need to be doing this as well. And so they're setting up all these reforms to do that. And so then you had early military pressure forced Muhammad to withdraw and his forces from elsewhere and really establish the modern borders of Egypt and Israel. Muhammad actually remains Egypt's ruler until 1849, and then his family actually holds power until 1952. So they really were a presence in Egypt for a very long time. So let's move down to the Ottoman Empire next. And so there's going to be a lot to pick apart there. I'm probably going to butcher some names, so I'll do the best I can. And so again, the Ottoman Empire is also reforming. And they're looking at the Europeans of like, how do we also do this as well? So at the end of the 18th century, you had the Sultan Selim III. He introduced some reforms to strengthen the military, help centralize the government, and then a big thing was standardize the tax system, because that is something that is difficult to really make efficient, and so cut out any sort of embezzlement and things like that. That's hard to do in an age before technology, and so they were looking at what the Europeans were doing and trying to change that as well. You had some tension between the Sultanate and a group called the Janissaries, which actually sparked what's called the Janissary Revolt. And this happens in Serbia in 1805. This is where some Serbian peasants helped defeat the Janissary uprising, and then went on to make Serbia independent of the Ottoman Empire. And then eventually Selim suspends his reform program. This happens about 1806 to prevent a massive military uprising in Istanbul, which is an important city for the Ottoman Empire overall. A lot of trade, technology, culture, all those things takes place there. And actually, Selim was captured and executed before reform forces could take the capital. Then you see the Greeks gain independence from the Ottoman Empire as well in 1829. Britain, France, Russia viewed the Greeks as not Ottomans, and so they really helped with that process of getting them free. And so they assisted the Greeks in their struggle, and then regarded the Greek victories as a triumph for the European civilization. And kind of a little bit racist, but they viewed them as white, and that's why they pushed for that. Sultan Mahmud II, which is the name on there, believed that the loss of Greece really indicated the profound weakness of the Ottoman military, and hurt and really showed the weakness in their financial organization as well. Which that's kind of been the Ottomans' entire existence. That's why they're not around today, is because they really weren't that strong militarily, and their financial systems were not conducive for them being a prosperous, industrialized country. And so Muhammad used this outrage over losing Greece to justify several reforms that included a creation of a new military corps. He eliminated the group, the Janissaries. He reduced the political power of the religious elite, and he was really kind of secularizing the reform program, and you see this further take place in the Tanzimat, which you see up there, what's known as the restructuring Tanzimat reforms. And this happens by his successor, Abdul Mahid, in 1839. And so what you're seeing here, I know that's kind of a lot of information, names, stuff like that, but what you're seeing here is them really trying to, look, we lost this, because Greece is a series of islands and ports. Like, that is an extremely expensive thing to lose. And so they're trying to reform things so that they're able to hold on to these things from now on. You had military cadets that were sent to France and Germany for training because they were trying to reform the Ottoman military education system, which ended up becoming kind of their general education system. They started reforming things left and right. You had foreign subjects were taught. You had foreign instructors were ended up being employed. And then really France became the preferred language because of these reforms. This ended up stimulating growth and the wealth and influence of urban elites. It ended up bringing about some unexpected cultural and social effects that ranged from European clothes being instituted more in this, and this is a Muslim society, so things are changing. And then also had access to the courts for all male subjects, and everybody was equalized under the taxation system. Now, you need to realize is that these Tanzimat reforms were explicitly for men, like they weren't for women. You started seeing a decrease in influence of women, and the development of a cash economy and competitive labor market that drove women from the workforce. So you started seeing some of these things take place that ended up hurting women's rights. All right, so the last thing on here is the Crimean War and its aftermath. So you may have heard of Crimea in the last several years with Russia annexing it. And so what you see is Russia actually is trying to expand during this time as well into Crimea. And so they expanded southward at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. And this is what led them simply wanting the Crimean Peninsula. This is what led to the Crimean War. And so you have an alliance of Britain, France, Ottoman Empire, and defeated Russia, and then blocked the Russian expansion into Eastern Europe and the Middle East. So again, that alliance is also, so we're talking right now about imperialism, but that alliance system is also important. That you're starting to see these early alliances form, and that is some of those early indications that a world war is going to take place. Now, The Crimean War brought significant changes to really all combatants. Um, the Russian government was further discredited and forced into making reforms. Britain, France carried out extensive propaganda campaigns that emphasized their roles in the war. The French press promoted a sense of unity between Turkish and French society. So you see the media really start to take place. Now, the Crimean War is important because it marks, and I'll make sure you write this down, this marks the transition from traditional warfare to modern warfare. So things like percussion caps, breech loading rifles, these were all used. Again, other military technology that included the invention of machine guns, railway systems, for the transfer of weapons and men, and then in trench warfare, which is all things that we are used to talking about strictly with World War One, but you see it take place before. After the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire continued to establish a lot of other reforms, financial, commercial institutions. They were really trying to model themselves after the British. This contributed to a shift in population from rural to urban, which had happened in other places in the world and is starting to happen in the Ottoman Empire. Wage labor classes and things like that. What happens here is that because of these reforms, there's always issues, like things don't change easily, and so the Ottoman state's dependence started being on foreign loans, and so you had a trade deficit, inflation, and then around the time that the Civil War is ending, 1860s, 70s, you have some major issues with the economy, and things start to change. And so around that time, you have the discussion of a law that would have permitted all men to vote left Muslims worried the Ottoman Empire was no longer a Muslim society. And so you had some Muslim hostilities against Christians because of this. The decline of the Ottoman power and wealth inspired a group of educated urban men known as the Young Ottomans to band together to work for constitutionalism, liberal reform, and the creation of the Turkish national state in place of the empire. You actually had a constitution was granted in 1876, but eventually there was a coup, put a more conservative ruler on the throne, and so the Ottoman Empire was weakened and ended up no longer existing somewhere around 1922, right after after World War One. And so this is the Ottoman Empire. I want you guys to pay attention because this covers a lot of the Middle East today, and even into Northern Africa a little bit. So that's kind of the middle. It's the only time really in history that you see this entire region combined under one. Some of the modern troops that were instituted. Okay, so let's move over to Russia now. And Russian history is actually one of my favorites just because there's so much that happens all the time. And they never can quite get it right. And some historians argue that they still haven't. But that's kind of a political question. So let's talk about Russia and Europe first. And so we're going to go back a little bit into about 1700. Only 3% of the Russian population actually lived in cities. And so Russia was actually slow to acquire modern infrastructure and modern forms of transportation. And so while Russia wanted to be Western style, especially in their economic development, there was fear of political change, and that prevented real progress. But nonetheless, Russia had more in common with the European nations as it did than the Ottoman Empire. And so you have a group called Slavophiles, and Westernizers ended up debating the proper course for Russian development. And so the Slavophiles, that's the Slavics, or the Slavs, that's them. And the Western part, they're really kind of going after, which one do we want to stay true to our roots, or do we need to Westernize to survive? And so you had diplomatic inclusion of Russia among the great powers of Europe was countered by a powerful sense of what was called Russophobia. And so Russia had some things that was keeping them from fully becoming more Western, which is where a lot of the government wanted to go because they're watching what's happening in Europe right now. By the end of the 18th century, the Russian Empire had reached the Pacific Ocean and the borders of China. In the 19th century, Russian expansion continued to the south, bringing Russia into conflict with Japan, China, Iran, and even the Ottoman Empire. And then Great Britain took steps to halt Russian expansion before Russia gained control of all of Central Asia. And so you had a lot of, like, Russia was going into a lot of territories that people didn't really want. But then because they were getting those places that people didn't really want, they were getting close to places that people did. And so that was causing issues there. And so next, let's talk about some cultural trends. Russia had cultural contact with Europe since really the late 17th century. You had some reforms from Alexander the First, which promised more on paper than they actually delivered. You had a lot of opposition to reforms. This mostly came from wealthy families who feared the reform would bring like imperial issues. This was realized with the reign of Nicholas the First. And then you have this interesting moment called the Decembrist Revolt. And this was carried out by a group of like more reform-minded military officers after the death of Alexander the First. But they were actually defeated, and because of their defeat, it didn't allow reform for really 3 decades. You had heavy penalties imposed on Russia in the treaty that ended the Crimean War, and the new Tsar Alexander II was called upon to make some major reforms at that point. And so he really looks at what his grandfather did. And so the reforms and cultural trends began under his grandfather, and then expanded under him. And so then in the 19th century, you saw numerous Russian scholarly and scientific achievements, as well as the emergence of a lot of Russians writers and thinkers and intellectualists and things like this. The big thing about Alexander II is that he, as it says there, he abolishes serfdom, which is their form of slavery. And so that allowed for people to, what was good for the country is it allowed for them to actually make money and pay taxes. But it allowed people a sense of freedom and to want to fight for their country. All right, now let's move over to the Qing Empire. Which is interesting. That is Qing, and so one of the more interesting moments is the Opium War. So we're going to get into that right now as well. So the Qing had conquered, the Qing dynasty, that group of Qing leaders conquered China in around the 1600s, and they restored peace, stability, promoted recovery, and expansion of agricultural economy, and really this is laying the foundation for what doubles the Chinese population between 1650 and 1800. And by 1800, that population pressure was really causing environmental damage, contributing to the increasing number of lowly farm hands, laborers, and merchants. There were numerous sources of discontent as well. You had various minority peoples that were driven off their lands. Many people regarded the government as weak, corrupt, perhaps collusion with merchants and missionaries, and really 2 specific places like Canton and Macao. And then the discontent was really came to light with some internal rebellions in the 19th century, beginning with the White Lotus Rebellion. And make sure that's one of those things. The White Lotus Rebellion is where you need to kind of look at it. What's the basics of it? Do that research on your own. It'll help you remember it actually better. Anyways, now for one of my favorite moments in Asian history is the Opium War, and I say favorite just because it's interesting. If you're Chinese, it's definitely not a good moment. And so this is really where you see the first, in my opinion, one of like the first major effects of imperialism take place, especially particularly by the British. And so believing the Europeans to be remote and relatively unimportant people, the Qing did not at first really pay much attention to like trade issues or the growth in opium trade or anything like that. And opium is it comes from the poppy plant. It's a drug, it's a hallucinogen, it's a kind of like weed, that kind of thing. And so you have an influx of opium in the country because people were addicted and wanted it. But you don't see them really like understand the effects of it for a long time. And so around 1839, the Qing government realized the harm that was happening because of the opium trade, and they decided to ban the use of an import of opium, and sent an individual named Lin Zexu to Canton, and that's Linzexu to Canton to deal with the matter. The ban didn't work. Actually backfired heavily for the Chinese and for the Qing, and this actually led to the Opium War, which is from 1839 to 1842. And really, what happens is the British were like, no, this is a major way of making money and keeping the trade in our favor, because they were getting a ton of tea from the Chinese, and so they actually invoke a war, and it's basically where armed British naval and ground forces defeat the Qing actually fairly easily, and they force them to sign what's called the Treaty of Nanking. And this treaty, as well as some subsequent, man, I'm butchering that word, treaties signed between the Qing and various Western powers, gave them privileges and resulted to some small pockets there. But really what it did is, like, you're going to continue to take the opium and we're going to continue to get the tea. Next, you have the Taiping Rebellion. This breaks out in what's called the Guangxi province, which I don't think's on there. That's Guangxi. And this is where you had poor farmland, endemic poverty, economic distress, all these things caused divisions and really regulated the Hakka people to the lowliest of trades. And so the founder of the Taiping movement was an individual named Hong Jingquan, and that's Hong like Hong Kong, and then Xiuquan. And he was a man of this minority group, the Hakka, Hakka, and he had background there. And so he was familiar with teaching of Christian missionaries in Canton, because that's kind of the cultural hub and even the religious hub. And so Hong declared himself to be like the younger brother of Jesus, and founded the religious group called the Heavenly Kingdom of the Great Peace, or the Taiping movement, in which he recruited followers among the Hakka people. The Taiping forces actually defeated imperial troops in Kangxi, and then they recruited or forced villagers into their segregated male and female battalions. And so they worked as teams, and they moved towards the eastern and northern China. In 1853, the Taiping forces captured Nanjing and made it the capital of their Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. But eventually the Qing were like, no, that's not how we're going to do this. And so they finally defeat the Taiping, and with the help of military forces, and organized provincial governors like Zheng Gufan, which is down there at the bottom. And he had the assistance of the British and the French, because the British and the French had a lot of money and reason for wanting to keep that place strong and important. The Taiping Rebellion is one of the world's bloodiest civil wars and the greatest armed conflict of the 20th century. The results of the rebellion included about 20 to 30 million deaths, depopulation, destruction of rich agriculture lands in central and eastern China, and then you saw some major changes take place there. Then you have kind of the decentralization and the end of the Qing Empire. And so after the 1850s, the expenses of the wars, the burdens of the indemnities payable to the Western governments made it impossible for the Qing to get out of debt. And with the Qing government so far into debt, the British and the French became active participants in a period of recovery called the Tongzhi Restoration, which followed the Taiping Rebellion. Tongzhi is Tongzhi. The real work of recovery, managed by the provincial governors like Zheng Gufan, looked to the United States as his model to restore things like agriculture, reform the military, and industrialize their armaments and things like that. And so their reform programs were supported and pushed by the Qing aristocrats because they saw the benefits. But they were unable to prevent the the empire from disintegrating into really large power zones where provincial governments had the real authority. And so this is what we're looking at here. This map gives you an idea of where all these things take place. All right, guys, that's all I got for chapter 23. I know it's a lot of new content, and so I'm going to try to spend some time on some individual areas here. But if you have questions, like always, maybe you just don't understand something, don't understand the typing rebellion or something, just let me know. Happy to help. Come see me. I want to make sure you understand this.